Okay, I've started recording. The problem. Oh yeah, so sorry. I didn't hold the hotkey while I just said what I said. I've just started recording. The problem is that what I'm trying to explain or want to get into is incredibly dependent on like wording and legalese almost, and it's like it's a very sort of finicky issue, but it is it's a very important part of the dysfunction in South African politics, at least, and it's as far as I can see it, it's the instantiation of social justice warrior type ideology in the political culture, and it's actually corrupted the constitution, and it's like, well, it's having very bad toxic effects in which there can be no resolution essentially to the issues that it involves, which is basically the idea that there is something like a zero sum social justice. But anyway, just to get into it in particular, like the, the brilliance of the new South African dispensation was the constitution, which is like really a marvel. It works, it functions very well. It actually is like a moral beacon. It is filled with principles and a kind of elaboration of those principles. It works on a first principle basis. It actually has like a built-in logic to it and philosophy, which is a very advanced philosophy. And famously, it is based in non-racialism and non-sexism, which is not the same thing as anti-racism or or some kind of racialist justice. It's like fundamentally people are not, they do not belong to those identity categories. Those are just labels or something like that. That's like almost the moral premise of all the thinking gone into it. That you can't treat people essentially as tokens in some kind of racketeering of some kind of social justice. And in fact, it defines social justice as bearing the hallmarks of being non-racialist and non-sexist. Anyway, so I mean, it just shows the level to which what is generally regarded as secondary legislation. So, like the constitution itself gives a duty and an obligation to the legislature to enact certain policies and acts of parliament to fulfill the rights and obligations embedded in the constitution. And one of these things has to do with equality. And so that's what I'm basically going to focus on is the sort of the notion of equality. And this is interesting because I would say that the interpretation of the secondary legislation of the Equality Act is probably the same kind of ideological poison that is. I actually think that this act was actually generated by an American academic. I think when Parliament was drafting this legislation, it wasn't drafted by South African jurists or legal philosophers. They got some liberal from some American university to basically fudge the whole thing. But anyway, that's another point. I mean, I'll also say so-called liberal. But sadly, I'm afraid that the logic of the so-called liberals is also patently fascistic, but that I'll get into in the elaboration of some of the finer points. So, one of the things that Section 9 of the Bill of Rights does, which is the Equality Clause, I'll actually, let me just read it, which is basically the prohibition against unfair discrimination. And it can be misread strangely, and sadly, the horrible thing about the social justice sort of interpretation of these things is that it uses the same words, it uses the same labels, and it just kind of understands them in a completely different way. But it does alter the structure that I'm going to sort of that's in the Constitution. So although it's sort of, that takes a lot of elaboration. Okay, let me try and find this now. I should have set this up beforehand. Okay. Uh, I should probably read out the whole of section 9, but the little snippet that I have is just of subsection 2, which is, and this is the crux of everything, where it says, equality includes the full and equal enjoyment of rights and freedoms. To promote the achievement of equality, legislative and other measures designed to protect or advance persons or categories of persons disadvantaged by unfair discrimination may be taken. So, what the secondary legislation does is it makes up this new term called previously disadvantaged. Persons belonging to groups that were previously disadvantaged. So it actually says that the group itself is previously disadvantaged, and then you can belong to a group of people who were previously disadvantaged as a group, which somewhat gets you a little bit removed from the idea that you have persons who are in particular disadvantaged, which is not necessarily bounded to history, that they are disadvantaged, as in like disadvantaged has an ed on it in section subsection 2 of section 9 of the Bill of Rights, but that is the adjective present tense, disadvantaged by unfair discrimination. That's a condition that exists in the present. It's not a historical tag or label that someone can just merely share in. It actually pertains to a person. And then you would merely use categories of persons is important for it to say categories of persons, is because obviously when you're creating a legislative measure to try and advantage people who are disadvantaged, you obviously have to identify them as being, being able to apply for that measure, or being able to gain a benefit from that legislative measure, which is meant to sort of advantage those persons. But essentially this has been taken to mean that you can impose unfair discrimination on other people in order to provide an advantage to somebody else who's been disadvantaged by unfair discrimination. This has been interpreted to mean that government is allowed essentially to make two wrongs make a right. That you sort of, you can get a token of some category of persons that is going to be advantaged from disadvantaging unfairly other people, and that the second disadvantage is made fair by the fact that two wrongs make a right, or something like that, which is just it's to me it's obviously alien, because the whole point of the legislature is to protect and advance persons or categories of persons that have a condition of disadvantaged by unfair discrimination. That how can you do that by merely by essentially just generating a new cycle, let's just say. You wouldn't be then protecting persons. You would be protecting some persons exclusively. And so essentially, okay, this is where it gets very nuanced or whatever, but the basic idea is that all this is saying is that you can create an exclusive advantage that you hand out to some people, and other people are in some sense indirectly not advantaged because they're not allowed to receive the advantage being advanced by that program, or by that legislative measure. But that's not the same thing as being actively disadvantaged by unfair discrimination. It's merely creating something that's specialized in some sense. So this is the distinction that I think the whole identity politics actually does not take heed of, is that simply being able to take special measures in some sense that indirectly is in some abstract sense discriminatory because it doesn't advantage everyone equally. It advantages some and it doesn't advantage other people. That's not the same thing as disadvantaging other people in order to provide the advantage to the some. Yeah, this is so hard to. I mean, it's almost so common sense on some level that to laboriously lay it out, it just sounds very dry. But it's also, yeah. I know. Did you follow that?
Yeah, yeah. No, I understand what you're saying. I mean, I mean, and I agree with what you're saying, that like it seems so it's like common sense is a good way to put it, to where it's hard to really understand and grasp like why why it's something that needs to be laid out like in this fashion. You know what I'm saying? Like I mean, I don't know. It just makes sense. It just makes sense to me that that you shouldn't, that there's no basically some type of legislation that is designed to supposedly combat discrimination and uses discrimination to combat discrimination doesn't seem like it's very true to its purpose.
Yeah, I mean, I have other more technical ways that I think are almost more poetically sort of describe the problem of this, is that effectively, obviously, this is not made to empower government or the legislature to effectively decide what is and is not unfair discrimination, essentially, to redefine the term ideologically, that some discrimination will be fair just because government decides to do, you know, essentially by what I would call plenary fiat, you know. But it is empowering government essentially to have a very particular solution to a very particular problem that was caused by unfair discrimination. And so because there's a very particular problem and an ongoing condition of disadvantage caused by unfair discrimination, it is allowed to provide a special advantage, essentially. But that advantage cannot be made from directly new discrimination that disadvantages people. It can, in a sense, it indirectly doesn't. You see, I don't even want to say that it indirectly disadvantages them. I mean, in some technical sense, that's also true, but that's even more far removed. It just directly doesn't advantage them. That's all it does, is that it directly doesn't advantage them. But what's even crazier is that in the secondary legislation, which is called the Equality Act, essentially in my country, the promotion and I don't have my notes in front of me, but yeah, it's something like the promotion of equality and anyways, it's something like the Promotion of Equality Act. It's got a slightly longer title than that. It actually does something very strange, but it basically imposes obligations on people, on industries, on private individuals, essentially to use the logic of basically providing advantages made from unfair discrimination of other people. So instead of government doing its job and creating measures that actually fill gaps and fix specific problems, it just has this general notion of promoting people. So so their measure that they chose to do was just a general form of generic promotion, which essentially means that the problem of fixing disadvantage becomes fudged. And I'm using the word fudged in a technical sense. And fudging a problem is very problematic from a moral point of view, because it ends up making the issue that it is trying to solve, it turns that into fudge, first of all, which means that it becomes very nebulous, very vague. It sort of, it ends up just sort of just melting into everything, and just sort of, like you can't actually contain it. It just, everything becomes linked to it. And this is exactly what's happened in social justice ideology, is that like it just sort of, it becomes the cultural subtext for everything. It becomes the moral landscape itself. It's meant to just sort of control the public discourse and the whole culture itself. And this is also the vector of fascistic promulgation, is all I can say. I mean, it does spread like a contagion, like a very, I mean, this is why Hitler had these people who he loved. They were not really his political opposition. He called them useful idiots because they spread fascistic values even though they did not identify as being fascistic. They had the same moral engine. They just actually believed that there would be a rainbow Hitler that would mediate and solve everyone's problems and bring justice to every layer of potential identity. Whereas the fascists know that you can actually only have a state power that serves one identity, because otherwise the whole thing, like, it doesn't work with political power because it's too hypothetical. Like in its, so I mean, like, it's, if you create a zero-sum machine for solving problems, which is essentially what I'm relating to the fudging issue. But that on a philosophical level is also interesting to go into, because how problems are fudged and what fudging actually, I use it as a technical term. Essentially, what fudging is, sorry, I'm jumping around a bit, is it doesn't actually have to do directly with the problem, although the issue that it's treating becomes fudge. Fudging has to do with what the solution is. So fudging happens when you've got a formula, when you've got this sort of like, this is the thing that we're going to use, and because this is like what moral correctness looks like, this is the answer to the problem. When that answer effectively has no way of knowing when it's done the job, it has no way of knowing when it's solved the problem, and so you basically, but also what's worse is that you can't just do it forever. You can't just keep on doing it, because at some point, because it has no inbuilt idea of like when it's finished its work, you have to almost thumbsuck and you have to say, okay, we've done enough. That is literally what fudging is because it's not like, it doesn't have a resolution. It just has, someone has to collectively say with a group of other people, we can't go any further on this matter, and this is also, you hear this echoed in a lot of the liberal thinking, when they complain and they complain and they complain, and then they get to the point where they say, yes, these issues are very sophisticated, these issues are very complex. These are all marks of it being a fudged, sort of moral domain that has been set up, where it creates this endless list of confusion and problems, and that also, sadly and funnily enough, also means that it keeps on facilitating the concentration of power. It keeps on wanting to create nexuses of authoritarian administration and control, because you need to have ad hoc mediation, because fudging can only be orchestrated essentially by committee. It can't be orchestrated by a rule of law. You can't have equal laws and equal rules and regulations. You have to have very brittle moral codes that are reactive to a kind of groupthink, is the only way I can describe it. But sorry, I'm switching between an intellectual breakdown and also like a cultural sort of description of how these things play out. But it's interesting, and now this is going to seem very tangential and crazy, but I don't know how familiar you are with the Lord of the Rings. But I do consider Lord of the Rings to be a kind of fantasy, almost sci-fi depiction of the ideology of fascism. And there are a lot of things in the Lord of the Rings which I don't know if it's worth setting all of this up, but you have like all the rings, like 7 rings made for the elves, 9 rings made for men and things like that. These are all separate but equal magisteria, and they all have different internal structures of lived experience or whatever, and they all are characterized by these very definitive numbers. But then there was one ring made in secret to rule them all, the Ring of Power, which grants the power of invisibility. Um, this, was first discovered, at least in the story of the Lord of the Rings, by Smeagol, and upon discovering it, he killed his other fellow travelers fighting over the Ring of Power. Um, and it's interesting because there's a whole split within Smeagol or Gollum, because Smeagol says that, oh, it was an accident. We fought and I killed my fellow travelers. Over the possession of this Ring of Power. That origin story, I know this is a huge tangent and elaboration, I believe is almost significant, and you see this in students now, and you see this in how they're conditioning students, where there is this sort of there are two stories. There's this idea that, well, Gollum murdered those people for the Ring of Power, and Smeagol says it was an accident, but he knows that it wasn't really an accident. But there's this stark division within Smeagol Gollum, and that, I think, the whole Smeagol Gollum thing, I think, is almost like a psychological reduction of how this culture and psychology sort of operates, in that killing your fellow travelers for the One Ring is something like, uh, it generates a kind of autism. Like Smeagol and Gollum, he has a dichotomy within himself, so he kind of, he's never alone with himself in some sense, and this is the same thing that this sort of psychology does to people, in that there might be other lived experiences of other fellow travelers, but we've killed them for the possession of the Ring of Power, which I should have elaborated more, that when you have all these rings, and sort of the apex of that is that it's all reducible to power, um, in that secretly there's like a hidden hand of influence, or thing that it binds them all. It binds all the different rings, because in their separate magisteria of lived experience and different internal orchestration of value systems, within each of the seven, among the elves, and the nine rings among the kings of men. So they all have their different power structures within themselves. But the thing that they can all be reduced to is power. And when you have that reduction, that it's all reducible to power, then essentially you can do things by invisibility. And the only protection that you have, essentially, is the possession of the One Ring, which gives you the power of moral invisibility. What you do is beyond moral scrutiny. And so you can, as this internal division, that you just tell yourself, no, I didn't kill my fellow travelers to make myself an autistic human being, that merely loves my own internal connection to power, and my moral sort of disintegration, but also the special moral position. Let me just find my thread now. Sorry. Can you just mention anything of the thread that you were following in what I was saying? It would just help me find my.
I mean, you're basically comparing how well, I kind of wasn't 100% following I guess the comparison, or the parallel, I guess, drawn between like what we were initially talking about, and like the Lord of the Rings kind of example. Like, I think I was following parts of it, but then some parts of it, I guess, I mean, I understand. I guess I can kind of see. I guess I can kind of see like how what you're saying about the Lord, the kind of what's the Lord of the Rings as being something that you could relate to, like fascism in the ways that you were talking about, but as far as like how that kind of directly parallels like the social justice, like ideology, like kind of topic, I wasn't exactly drawing those clearly, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does parallel with the moral consideration or the moral calculation that is based on it, and I was sort of in the midst of trying to make that case, and substantiate the rationale within its sort of how it works, which does get into so I've found my feet slightly. So I'm basically trying to describe how, in using Gollum Smeagol as a kind of as the psychological model of how this stuff is, how the fascist culture exists within the mind of an individual adherent. Um, I was just basically trying to show how the macro moral consideration works on the micro level of an individual, and how they get inducted into this kind of culture and how they kind of correspond with it. And yeah, I understand that this it does. I guess thank you even for trying to follow, because it is quite sort of like a leeway, sort of going down the garden route, to see these things. But okay, so just to get some more description, and then perhaps hopefully it'll start to coalesce. Is that having this idea that you can murder your fellow travelers in order to secure your possession of the One Ring. I think that is a kind of, I am sort of.
Yeah, I see where that comes from.
Yeah.
That directly more makes sense now to me.
Yeah, and so bringing that very particular facet of Gollum's backstory as a central theme to understanding what's going on in his psyche. The idea that essentially that murder is also not a murder according to him. It's a mere almost accident of history in that sense, and that also brings through perhaps some of the parallel to the macro narrative that is used in identity politics. And then sorry, I'm just doing a trade at the same time. So I was going to get into this whole thing about how students are essentially being conditioned into this state that I think is exemplified by Smeagol Gollum, and you can see this in the promotion of the safe space culture, but essentially how the safe space culture, and this is also going to sort of go off on its strange tangent before it connects with these things, but it's something like so it's something like that. The thing that creates a safe space is this very orthodox understanding that there is there is a huge amount of certainty attached to the political subtext and an intellectual subtext about how the category system of society is structured. So essentially what creates a safe space is that no one is allowed to question the intellectual sort of structure of identity politics, which is essentially like described by, or vaguely is reminiscent of the different rings in the Lord of the Rings. So it's sort of like that becomes the scripture, or that becomes the unquestionable, sort of idea that you have these various lived experiences that have these separate and equal internal value systems, and you're not allowed to question, the internal view of these things. Um, there's no real way of mediating between these two different between those different magisteria. So it's like, well, I'm the ring within one of the rings of elves. So if you're in a different quadra in that, sort of scenario, it's like there are all these little specialized, layers of identity within identity, and they all have their kind of their strange, like you're not allowed to ever argue with it, because that person is merely a representative of almost like a moral majority of a group of people that can't be wrong in their own unique way, because you would have to be them in order to question them or disagree with them, so it's like, it's very strange that everyone is this, that issue itself has to always be fudged in such a way that it has to be treated with kid gloves, and that when you are addressing someone in that frame of mind, you are obligated to essentially establish their self-esteem constantly. You have to be actively establishing their self-esteem when you are engaging with someone who is in the safe space mode. And essentially, your ability to maintain their self-esteem and leave them unquestioned means essentially leaving that whole rigor of that structure, that categorization structure. All those intellectual implications are just, they are the law, they are the scripture in some sense. But anyway, that intellectual certainty is what allows for the emotional fragility, and so it's a juxtaposition between essentially the difference between Gollum and Smeagol, in that you can't say, it wasn't an accident that you killed your fellow travelers, I sympathize with your experience. You have to say that to Smeagol. You can't say, and then Smeagol, he really believes that it was an accident in his pure naivety. He will actually say that in his own voice, and then when he actually admits that when it was murder, that's not Smeagol, that's Gollum. So you actually have this weird fractured thing within yourself, having killed your fellow traveler, which is also probably also somewhat related to like the Harry Potter Horcrux stuff. But anyway, let me not elaborate too much, but yeah. So I just basically wanted to say that it's very interesting that essentially that the emotional fragility is only maintained by an intellectual subtext which cannot be questioned. And so it's very interesting is that you can get into these paradoxes where you might want to respond with, the subtext of this safe space is exploiting my projected identity. You're projecting things onto my identity, and I don't even want to have an identity. I want to just be a being having an interpersonal connection with people as I come across them. I don't want to be representative of a collective experience or being treated as a token of anything. And then they'll say, no, but but you might think that, but that's just naive, because you can still be reduced to those terms. And yes, it is true. You can always make an argument of reducing people into those terms. And essentially, the height of that argument is fundamentally power, because everything is reducible to power. And this is a separate intellectual point, but people think just because if something is rationally unquestionable, it's part of the truth. It's somehow like it's just part of a universal thing, and this is almost a spiritual kind of thing. But just because something might be true doesn't mean that it is the fundamental, or it doesn't even mean that it's a fundamental piece of some essential paradigm, or the idea that the truth sort of looks the same from every even what I'm saying now can be sort of, depending on how it's interpreted, you can anyway, anything can be cashed out as sorry, this is probably a fruitless line of explanation, but it's very easy with a very particular sort of economy of purpose in mind, that you can end up finding yourself correct, validating, your intellectual belief. But okay, just to further elaborate the point, the thing that keeps the Smeagol Gollum thing alive, and that I'm going to parallel with the safe space culture, is that you're not allowed to challenge people on the level of forcing them, or at least pushing them, to have an integrated view of their intellectual subtext with their emotional narrative, or their feeling stream of consciousness. You can't sort of say, I expect you to have these things more integrated. I expect you not only to represent your own raw feelings that I have to sort of accord with some sense of establishing its self-esteem and promoting that self-esteem, almost in a version of a kind of weird blind faith that has all these stark subtexts, intellectual subtexts, which I find, hypocritical and exploitative. It's interesting that I would say that the whole safe space culture is based on exploiting certain scapegoat identities. It all happens because one group is allowed to be vilified and allowed to sort of take on the collective guilt for what's missing in the narrative, in the same way that the Jews were used in Nazi Germany, effectively, that everything is reducible to a Jewish infiltration or a conspiracy. This is, you can make an argument. This is exactly how the argument of white privilege works, effectively, and that is not to say that some of those perspectives, in some small part, don't have. I'm not saying that they're fundamentally invalid in every technical aspect. I'm just saying that it's a fruitless way of reducing the problem. So if you choose to interpret problems like that, you can interpret problems through the level of identity. It just means that the solution will have to use the vehicle of identity to try and solve the problem, and because it's fundamentally a fudged method, it leads nowhere. It just spirals in on itself. It just becomes more and more of it. It just ends up having to infect itself, or it's weird that I would say the biggest problem of social justice is that it creates identity consciousness. It does not create solutions to the problems that it complains about. Famously, I think the biggest famous example of this is that women who believe that feminism is a poison can actually promote themselves and advance themselves as real human beings and individuals. And you get people like Margaret Thatcher, who become prime minister. And then you get liberal female politicians who believe in feminism. And essentially, they can never put themselves in the role of the leadership, because it's sort of, it would mean that, essentially it would be on their shoulders. It's the problem with the Führer principle. In some sense, the problem, and now I'm getting into the sort of the Nazi occult ideology is that the problem with fascism, in some intellectual sense, is that it can never be proven wrong, because it's a prophecy, it's a prediction, and if the prediction doesn't get delivered upon, it just means that you were invested into a false prophet. So it's like, in some sense, if the Führer fails, it's just because he wasn't the Führer. Führer actually literally means savior. But anyway, okay, I think I've actually fully now completely disintegrated my thesis, going into shitty, sort of side quests. But this is the problem, is that it almost, I'm afraid that it has to almost be considered all at once. And unless you use something like fiction, it's very hard to fully sort of illustrate the scope. So I'm going to stop the recording now because there's background noise that I don't want.